Is there someone here that's saying, okay, no, we need to verify this, or an editor that's
just
involved?
me. I'm really fact-checking and editing as I'm doing it live. I mean, I'll have an editor read behind me. If I wrote something really crazy, I'm sure someone would notice it and tell me about it. But formally, there isn't really, just because you have to be in the thing and keep updating it so much, there isn't really a way for someone else to get in there and change it. You know, I'll take breaks and people will go in and try to like clean up the language and make sure, you know, take out typos or fix the, fix the grammar. But for the most part, it's really what it is. It's just, here it is live, and it's the best we can do. And, but what I was saying is I really, I think it would be a mistake if people think it's really just kind of flinging stuff at the wall, which I think from the outside, people maybe don't read that much of it. They might hear about it and think that that's what it is. I can't stress enough, having spent, you know, at least 5 full years fact-checking, you know, getting a magazine story every single week, and a lot of them very long, and you have to get really, you know, spend a lot of time verifying every little thing. That kind of mindset doesn't really leave you, and I'm extremely careful about what I do refer to on the blog and what I'll say. And I do, there isn't really one way of verifying things, and there's only, you also get a little bit philosophical when you fact check, because the things are, you know, what do we know? You know, if you find a lot of sources you really believe it to be true, you know, you say you think it's true. But obviously there are things you can find out later where it turns out that wasn't true. What everybody thought was true wasn't true later, you know. And a good example of that, unfortunately, was the day the Fort Hood shootings happened. Yeah. I did live blogging about that. And, you know, in that case, most of what we were doing, I had a colleague in Washington who was, you know, talking to the Pentagon, because it's on a military base, it's a different kind of situation, and, you know, feeding me information of what they were saying there, the official sources. You know, we were following broadcasts on TV and the radio, and you could, you know, if you hear official spokespeople say things, you can say that they said them. You know, it's impossible for me to say from this distance what's happening on Fort Hood, but I can say the base commander came out and he says this, you know. But that's a good example of where that stuff isn't necessarily true, you know, because the base commander came out during the day and said to a bunch of reporters, here's what we know, these people are wounded, this happened, and the person who did the shooting is dead.
I remember that, yeah.
And that was part of the story all day, in every format. And, you know, I mean, there wasn't, you're not like relying on reporters going and talking to eyewitnesses to find out if that person's dead. You're waiting, it's an official source, and it's someone who you would think would know. It's not someone in the Pentagon saying it thousands of miles away. It's the person running that base. But obviously that's the confusion of a situation like that. There can be a mistake like that can be made. You know, the person was badly wounded. And then the base commander, they kept postponing the press conference where the person was going to follow up, and it just I kept writing. I think I wrote a bunch of times, you know, expected in like half an hour here, and I kept having to revise it and say, well, now we're expecting it later. And the person came out as I'd already said, you know, that's it for today, and I'm leaving, and, you know, please read our homepage for updates, and the articles were being written, you know, or had been written already, summarizing the events. So I think it was around 9 o'clock or a little bit later. The person finally came out, the base commander, his name I can't remember, and said he's not dead. The shooter's not dead. And I thought, well, I just turned on the computer again, and I took off my coat and wrote an update. And I said, this is what happened. He says this, and this is, you know. And I thought about going back and changing the earlier stuff, but that's not what it is, you know what I mean? And that would actually be kind of wrong. It'd be like going to the archive. It's weirdly like the archive now, instead of being after the day after it's printed, it's in the archive. It's after you hit publish, it's printed. You know what I mean? It's kind of like that's a record of what was going on. So it would be wrong to do that, you know. But I also remember, as I was watching the news on the television, just thinking about my part of like reporting it on the blog, I heard a big gasp come from my colleagues on the national desk who had just sent the first edition of the newspaper to be printed. And it was too late. It said on the front page the next morning, the very first edition, I mean, then they changed it, but the very first edition said, you know, in the subhead that the gunman was dead. So that's actually like an example, I think, of where, you know, later there was another blogger criticized me for getting that wrong, and was kind of doing it, I think, on the assumption that all we're doing is just like watching TV in any kind of wild room, or looking at Twitter in any wild room that comes up, we just put that on the blog. Yeah. But that's really not what it is. It's a process of trying to be very careful about what you do say. But you have to the audience has to be aware that this is sort of like reading the wires. It's sort of like being led into the newsroom, and we can tell you what we think is true, but that over time can change, you know, as it does anyway. And the fact that it was actually in print on the newspaper the next day is an example of how it's not fundamentally different, just the time frame has changed, you know.